In this presentation, we're going to explore the diagnostic criteria for an autism spectrum disorder as it is found in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition. So in this presentation, we're going to look at where do you find the criteria for an autism spectrum disorder, and then look at the specific criteria that are contained within it. In subsequent presentations, we're going to look in greater detail at these criteria, with particular reference as to the kind of behaviours that you might see in a clinic, or the kind of behaviours a parent might report or describe when you ask some simple questions. There are two main codes that are used across the world to make a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. The first is the International Classification of Diseases, or ICD, which at the moment is in its 10th edition, and you can find autism in the section on mental and behavioural disorders. Currently, we're awaiting the publication of the 11th edition, which is now expected in January 2022. The second code or manual is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, known as the DSM, which is currently in its 5th edition, which was published in May 2013. Over their lifetime, these two codes have varied the degree to which the diagnosis for autism was similar or different. And the reasons that explain this can be found in the reasons in which these codes were formed and the history and the politics that are formed around them. But in simplicity, the ICD, which was first formed in the 1890s, attempted to identify all the different ways in which people could die, but very soon progressed into a way of classifying all the medical conditions and diseases that someone could acquire that would require medical intervention. Developed by the World Health Organization based in Geneva, it now serves an important function for governments in making policy decisions on health, as well as in some countries is used for insurance purposes in classifying the kind of conditions that would be accepted. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual originated in the 1950s from the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, in their attempt to bring some consistency in the way that psychiatric conditions were diagnosed, because up until that point it was quite subjective. Not only did different psychiatrists diagnose conditions in their own way, different psychiatrists recognized certain conditions only. So across the globe, different countries, and in some countries different parts of the country, have adopted either of these codes. So for example, the ICD is more commonly found in European countries, whereas the DSM-5 was more commonly found in the United States, Canada, and some of the Antipodean countries like Australia and New Zealand. There also appears to have been some shift in the last 20 years in the popularity of the DSM, which is now seen increasingly used across the world, particularly since May 2013 with its updated criteria for a range of conditions. Even in Ireland there is considerable variance. In some parts of the country the ICD-10 is used, and in other parts the DSM-5. Though in the last few years the number of places and services using the DSM-5 has increased and certainly represents now the majority. It is anticipated that when the ICD-11 is published that it will be much more consistent and in line with the DSM-5. Its first formal identification by Leo Kanner in 1943 and Hans Asperger in 1944. The definition and understanding of autism has changed numerous times, both in the DSM and in the ICD. In fact, it wasn't until 1980 that autism was understood as a developmental disorder. Previously, it had been understood as a form of childhood schizophrenia. In fact, it wasn't until 1993 and 94 that the definition or criteria of autism looked similar in the ICD and DSM. Up until that point, they looked quite different. In 2013, the DSM brought out its 5th edition, and it significantly changed the criteria for autism, making it again very different from the ICD. The ICD-11 is still being formed and isn't expected to be published until January 2022, but it is understood that the criteria in the ICD-11 will match much closer to that of the DSM-5. Traditionally, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual was more popular in the United States of America and Canada, and some parts of the Antipodean like Australia and New Zealand, whereas the ICD, particularly in its 10th edition, was more popular in Europe. What we've seen over the last 20 to 25 years is an increase across the world of the use of the DSM-5, and since 2013 in particular, when the 5th edition came out, has become the more popular criteria to be used internationally. Even in Ireland, there is variance into which criteria is used. In some parts, the ICD-10 is still used, and in others, and probably in the greater parts of the country, it is the DSM-5. For the remainder of this presentation, we're going to be focusing on the criteria within the DSM-5. This is not only because it's the most popular one, but when the ICD-11 is published, it will be in line with the DSM-5, so represents the future direction of diagnosis. So what is the diagnostic criteria for autism in the DSM-5? There are five broad criteria. The first is that a child has persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. And that to meet this criteria, you must demonstrate all 3 of these sub-criteria. This thing of impaired social emotional reciprocity, impaired nonverbal communication, and impaired development of relationships. The second criteria, or criterion B, is that you demonstrate restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. The third criteria is that these symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, even though the difficulties from them may not be manifest till later, when the demands of interacting and the demands of life show them. Criterion D, that these symptoms must cause clinically significant impairment in important areas of current functioning. That is, it must show that it is impacting upon your everyday life. And criteria E is that these disturbances, these symptoms that are identified, are not better explained by having an intellectual disability or a global developmental delay. What we're going to do through this presentation is explore these 5 criteria in some detail, and with particular reference to the kind of behaviors that they're referring to. To better understand this diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5, it is worth briefly exploring how it changed from the DSM-4 and just to look at the reasons why. The DSM-4, published in 1994, which was in line with the ICD-10 published in 1993, focused upon what was known as the triad of impairments. That to have autism, someone must demonstrate impairments in interaction, impairments in communication, as well as restricted, repetitive, and stereotype patterns of behavior. And in the DSM-4, there were 5 separate conditions that came under this title of autism as a pervasive developmental disorder. The first was a thing called autism. The second thing was a thing called autistic disorder. Third, Asperger's syndrome. Fourth, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, or PDD-NOS. And Rett syndrome. To understand how these diagnoses were made for autism, need to appreciate that they took a polythetic approach. That is, you didn't need all of the criteria, you just needed to meet a certain number of them under different categories. So for example, to get a diagnosis of autism, you might need to demonstrate that you had at least 2 items from potentially 4 in impairments in interaction, that you had at least 1 item from potentially 4 in impairments in communication, and that you showed 1 item from potentially 4 of restricted, repetitive, and stereotype patterns of behavior. So as long as you had 6 of these items in total, with 2 from interaction, 1 from communication, and 1 from restricted and repetitive behaviors, then you would meet the criteria. This could result in the potential of over 2,200 different presentations if you took these criteria. So the diagnostic criteria changed in the DSM-5, where they collapsed the triad of impairment into a dyad. So no longer was it necessary to demonstrate separate impairments in both communication and in interaction. You simply needed to demonstrate that there were deficits in social communication and social interaction as a group, as well as then demonstrating restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. There were 2 main reasons for this. First, it was both conceptually and practically very different to separate out communication and social interaction. All communication is social and involves interaction because it involves communicating with people. All communication occurs in a social context. In many ways, there had been some very technical and arbitrary distinctions between what represented communication and what represented social interaction. Perfect example of this is the way that the eye contact was delineated from other nonverbal communicative behaviors. The second reason was that there was well-established research to demonstrate that many children were not showing impairments in their language or communication, but were in their social interaction. A good example of this is what we would classically understand as Asperger's syndrome, where language was in the average range, there weren't any specific language impairments. It was more in the pragmatic use of it, in the way that the language was being used to interact. So it meant that there were children who really should have met the criteria for autism that may have missed out on it because you couldn't demonstrate specific impairments in communication. The second major change is that they removed in the DSM-5 all these different groups or subtypes. So now there was no longer the different conditions of autism, autistic disorder, Asperger's, PDD-NOS, ideas of high-functioning autism. These were all removed. Research had well established that there was much confusion in the labeling of these different conditions, and the likelihood of you getting one varied from site to site. Secondly, considerable amount of effort was being spent in defining these groups rather than better ways of making diagnosis. Rett syndrome was also removed because it had been demonstrated to be a purely medical condition with genetic markers. So now in the DSM-5, there is simply the category or criteria of autism spectrum disorder. This also attempted to capture the idea of autism as a spectrum, as a continuum of different behaviors. The third major change is they moved back to what is known as a monothetic approach of making diagnosis, or a unified. That is, a child must show all core characteristics. So even though the child can present differently, they still meet the same criteria as every other child with an autism spectrum disorder. So now you must meet all 3 mandatory criteria in social communication and social interaction. Fourth major change is they were to include sensory sensitivities or sensory seeking behavior as part of the restrictive and repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities, as well as expanding the second domain to include more than just patterns of behavior. Despite adapting a monothetic approach where every child must meet the core criteria, all three of them in social communication and social interaction, they put greater emphasis in the DSM-5 in developing a profile of what they called specifiers, that is, the different difficulties that an individual child might experience as defining their individual experience of autism or the different way that their autism was presenting. And the last major change, and probably the most controversial, was that they put in a severity rating, which was really meant to reflect the level of need or support a person might require in the areas of communication and interaction, as well as in their restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior. The changes in the DSM-5 were not only attempting to increase the consistency of diagnosis across the globe, it was also attempting to acknowledge that autism was a spectrum, it was a continuum of a disorder. That is, it could present very differently across children. For one child, autism could look like them not talking, them being either pre-verbal or non-verbal, that they preferred to be on their own and play by themselves, that they wouldn't respond to their name when it was called, that they could spin, flap their hands and jump around on the spot, engage in the spinning of the wheels of cars for long periods of time, and line up toy cars in a repetitive way. But it was also meant to capture a child who could use lots of words. However, some of these phrases that they used seemed a little repetitive and seemed to be simply echoing something that they'd heard someone say once. That they could play with toys in some functional or imaginary way, but it was quite limited. But they did engage in some other unusual behaviors, such as they might smell and lick objects frequently, or they could become quite upset with the smallest changes in routine, such as driving a different way to the preschool, which you might not see in the child who was so aloof that they didn't really attend to what was happening around them. Which again differed very significantly from what we might think of as the little professor, who even in preschool was able to talk in full sentences, but would talk in monologues at great length of their topics of interest, where it was very hard to get a back and forth conversation, though they appeared very chatty. And even though they attempted to play with other children and were interested in other children, things just didn't seem to work well. And they seemed to have particular interest that was much more intense than their peers, such as being very interested in dinosaurs or planets and would read up on it all the time or be talking about it all the time. They also could take what people said very literally and misunderstand people, and seemed to be very rigid around rules. The DSM-5 also attempted to acknowledge another very significant fact that had been well established in research and literature, and that is autism can present very differently over time in the same child. So this child at the age of 3 could be a boy who's not yet using words, not responding to their name at all, could be very active and flit from toy to toy, spending no more than a few seconds with each, and could spend lots of time spinning the wheels and lining up the cars. However, if you meet the same child by 6 years of age, they were now using many phrases and some full sentences and could communicate their needs really quite well, were answering questions and even making commentary on things happening around them. They were able in junior infants or senior infants to sit at the table and engage in schoolwork and were doing relatively well. However, they might still be cognitively functioning at a level of intellectual disability if they had been assessed around 4 or 5. However, if you were to meet this child as even a few years later at 8 or 9, and certainly by 15 years of age, there was no hint of difficulties with language. They were keeping up with their academic work. They were showing no signs of an intellectual impairment at all. They, in fact, were now pursuing an area of interest with great intensity and were very knowledgeable about it, and had found areas of social exploration where they could pursue particular interests such as board gaming or attending conventions such as cosplay. They did in fact have some friends, and they were good friends and felt very comfortable, relaxed, and in fact would find that their way of interacting with these friends was very different from the way that they might interact with people they were less familiar with. However, now, unlike before, this child was now experiencing very high levels of anxiety. So understanding that autism can look very different for the same child as they grow older is very important for when we are looking to make a diagnosis. And this was wanted to be reflected in the DSM-5. However, despite all the variation in the way that autism can present across children, the DSM-5 wanted to emphasize that fundamentally there were some core characteristics when looking at diagnosis. All children who have an autism spectrum disorder must show that they have deficits in social communication and social interaction, as well as having restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. And that to meet the criteria for deficits in social communication and social interaction, a child must demonstrate impairments or deficits in all three of the criteria of showing impairments or deficits in social emotional reciprocity, as well as showing impairments or deficits in the use or understanding of nonverbal communication, as well as showing impairments or deficits in developing, maintaining, or understanding relationships. And then showing that they have 2 of the 4 potential restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. That is, a child must have either repetitive speech, or motor movements, or use of objects, or potentially show that they have either excessive adherence to routine, or excessive resistance to change, or excessive rigid thinking. Or a child shows that they have very circumscribed or restricted interests that are not as varied as their peers. Or that a child shows that they have sensory issues where they are either hypersensitive, that is, they are avoidant of certain sensory stimulation, or hyposensitive, where they seem oblivious to it and seem to be very sensory seeking as a result of it. To meet the criteria for a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and the DSM-5 must meet Part A, which is deficits in communication, social communication and interaction, as well as Part B, restrictive or repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activity. But there are also 3 other criteria that must be taken into consideration when making the diagnosis. First of these is Part C. That is, these characteristics or impairments, deficits, or symptoms that are seen in Part A and Part B must have been present in what is termed as the developmental period, which in the DSM-5 is understood up to 8 years of age. Now this differs, or is a big departure from what is in the DSM-4 and the ICD-10, where they specifically identify that these symptoms must be present by 3 years of age. And there were 2 main reasons this occurred. The first was that many children were not demonstrating significant impairments in their social communication and interaction until much later than 3 years of age, but by ages of 6, 8, or 9, when the social demands and expectations had increased significantly, these children were not functioning very well and would currently have met the criteria except for not having demonstrated them by 3 years of age. So what the DSM-5 is emphasizing or looking for is that if a child isn't functioning particularly well at the ages of 6, the fact that they were not markedly different at the age of 3 shouldn't get in the way of a diagnosis. But the second main reason, or the corollary or alternative profile that was being seen, is that there were many children who at the age of 6, 9, 12 or 15 seemed to be functioning much better in their social communication interaction, or not showing quite clearly as evident difficulties that they were when they were either a toddler or a preschooler. So for example, they'd improved in their eye contact, they were showing better use of gestures, they seemed better able to develop friends and maintain them, and to describe what represents a friend. However, these children were still struggling in a number of areas. And what is understood within the DSM-5 and the intent of the committee that created the criteria is that these children are still probably presenting with an autism spectrum disorder. They simply have learned strategies as they have grown older to manage situations, or they have learned better how to mask their difficulties, that they were less able to hide when they were 3 years of age. So if you're meeting a child who at the age of 5 or 6 seems to be showing some levels of eye contact, or at the age of 9 seems to have quite good eye contact, but there was a plethora of difficulties they had when they were 2, 3 or 4 years of age that the parents are reporting, this still may well be autism that we're talking about. And therefore a diagnosis needs to be made in the context of both how they are functioning currently, but how they functioned in the past. Part D is that even if a child is presenting with clear impairments in social communication and social interaction, and is showing restrictive or repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities, and these were present in the early developmental period, unless these are manifesting in a way that are causing impairment in everyday functioning, whether it be socially or at school or in being independent, then it's not sufficient for it to be autism. So there must be demonstration that this is having impact upon the child's ability to manage themselves in the world. A caveat to this is that if a child is doing very well at school, but when they come home, they're not doing very well because they've managed to hold themselves together, they've managed to follow the structure of the school rules, work, but by the time they've come home, they can no longer keep themselves together, therefore completely unravel. This still may well be autism. They have simply demonstrated good coping skills in one context. If you then find that this child is also very unable to go out into public settings or can have frequent meltdowns, this is something that can be considered to be affecting them across areas of functioning. Part E, the fifth criteria, is that all of these difficulties should not be better explained or more easily explained by simply having an intellectual disability, or what could be called a global developmental disorder in much younger children. That is, if those difficulties in social communication and social interaction, or those stereotyped behaviors, are more clearly explained by having global deficits, that is, deficits in all areas evenly across all aspects of functioning, that in communication, in interaction, in daily life skills and independence, in cognitive ability, and also in general learning, then that is a better explainer of those difficulties, therefore should not be attributed to autism. This is where things can get a little tricky for children who are displaying very significant impairment across the board, because a child can have both an intellectual disability and an autism spectrum disorder together. The way we look for that is that their social communication and interaction abilities seem even less able than their overall functioning altogether, or they're demonstrating such clear restrictive or repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, or activities that this really can only be explained by having an autism spectrum disorder. So there are fundamentally 7 criteria to be looking at in the DSM-5 for autism spectrum disorder. What the DSM-5 also requests or expects that is done is that rather than saying that these 7 criteria, or at least the 3 in the social communication and social interaction, and 2 of the 4 in restrictive or repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities are met, is that there is also specification of the degree of difficulties that you will see in language or intellectual functioning or adaptive functioning, when it was onset, whether it was early onset or later onset, whether there is a comorbidity in having other conditions like ADHD, anxiety, or mood disorders, and whether this autism could be explained by having a medical condition or chromosomal disorder. So you're specifying the way that this autism not only presents, but the way that it interacts with other difficulties or conditions. So it's quite possible for a child to have an autism spectrum disorder and dyspraxia, or developmental coordination disorder. It's quite possible for a child to have an autism spectrum disorder and expressive language difficulties, or developmental language disorder, or language delay, that are now better explained by having an autism spectrum disorder than they are as being a separate condition. Which is different from the idea of that a child might be presenting with autism spectrum disorder and a separate disorder like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or anxiety disorder, or a mood disorder. Lastly, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition, the DSM-5, they brought in a new disorder or condition known as social pragmatic communication disorder. This was an attempt to replace the PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, where what you saw that there were deficits in social communication and social interaction, but there were no restrictive or repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. And if there are no restrictive repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities, but there were clear deficits in social communication and social interaction, this was not seen as an autism, but as this new condition, social pragmatic communication disorder. Since its inception in May 2013 in the DSM-5, this has been highly controversial, and there has been very low take-up by any services across the world, and has received very little research, and is currently just lies dormant in the DSM-5